So I apologize for forcing you to have to use your tablets, right? But I figured, since we have this interesting interactive technology that I would actually have a slide deck to help guide us through this future think discovery. So just a little bit about my background. For those of you who don't know me, I have a PhD in optical engineering from the University of Rochester, and I went to MIT as an undergrad. And so I was an engineer and scientist by training before I ever entered into the business world. But I was also fortunate enough to work at several interesting think tanks, this one being the last one. But the first one was AT&T Bell Laboratories. And I worked there in the early 90s, and between 93 and 94 with Arnold Penzias, who at the time was the CTO of AT&T. And he had this future thought that R&D was in trouble, and that the traditional R&D lab was going to disappear, and he wanted to save Bell Labs. Now, we could say, did he save it or didn't he? In many ways, it's gone, right? And the reality is, this is a really disappointing event in our society and for our economic impact. Most of the venture technologies that have been successful have been a result of research that was going on at AT&T, IBM, GE, Hewlett-Packard. And these R&D labs have become businesses that really are focused on the next generation product, looking maybe at best 3 years into the future. At Bell Labs, we were looking 15 years in the future, 20 years in the future. And the research I was doing there was in optical networking and optical computing, and we still haven't actually seen that come to the market. And maybe part of the reason is Bell Labs disappeared. So the question is, how can we change that? How can we make up the difference? So a lot of the focus of my talk is on that. Now, the second place I worked was the RAND Corporation, which is a place where the future is constantly being thought of, both from the perspective of societal rate of return, economic value, how do we create value in a capitalistic marketplace, as well as for our defense industry. And I was on a team there where we were working with the Santa Fe Institute to look at combining scenario planning with public policy. And so I was able to be there to learn about how to strategize in thinking about the future. The third place I worked was McKinsey & Company. And there we got to actually deploy strategy thinking in the form of fast-changing environments with technology companies. So while I was at McKinsey, I met Tim Draper, and Tim Draper's grandfather helped start the venture community in Silicon Valley. And I was at the center of the Draper network and how he actually franchised venture capital around the globe and made it actually, something that all entrepreneurs around the world had access to. And they opened like 35 funds globally. And we were the first fund that they started in LA, Zone Ventures. So for 10 years before coming into Intellectual Ventures, I actually got to be a VC. So my talk is really going to be about my experience as a VC, being a venture capitalist during the bubble, investing through the bubble, and then actually realizing had we actually had what I understand now of intellectual property, how our fund could have gotten way better returns for our investors than we were able to get. So what is the state of the market is the question. Is the venture capital industry really in trouble? And there's two ways to measure success in venture capital. One could be returns to LPs. And certainly the returns to LPs are at best anemic today. This first slide is actually a slide that I actually created in 2003. It actually showed the history of returns in venture capital. So data was only starting to be collected in the early 80s. And so as you can see, during the bubble of the biotech industry in the 80s, returns were anemic. And then we sort of had this big spike in the 90s. Now, the numbers at the bottom are actually the year that a fund was raised. So it's not actually the returns in that year. It's actually the returns of the funds that were raised in that year. So 1997 was arguably, or 96 was actually the best year. So, and that's because 4 years later, all those companies went public in 2000. And they were going public at an astronomical rate, like 18 months. I think There were several companies. A friend of mine was CTO of an optical company, spun out of MIT, went public within 18 months. So that's why you're seeing these greater than 80% returns. Probably will never happen again. Kind of like the Nortel deal in IP, you get these spikes that are kind of very unusual. But the reality is, if you look at sort of 1990, 1991, 1992, where it looked like the market had actually stabilized, that was because only $1 billion a year was being invested. So today, $40 billion a year gets invested in venture capital. And so the reason why it could be broken is simply because there's too much cash investing in a lot of companies that are all trying to do the same thing. As we know in IP, there are not that many great ideas. And so if you triple the investment or invest 100 times as much, you're only creating competition for the same ideas, in which case you're depleting the value in the market. So if we go up a year, so we look to 2008, so this is looking at the data today. So a 2008 vintage fund would be starting to get returns 4 years later, 2013, and we're still seeing negative returns. So, is the venture industry broken? Well, if you pull out 500 funds and you leave 29 of the top funds, that number would look very different. So the top 30 funds are actually returning capital. So you could argue that those top 30 funds, which are only investing $1 billion, are actually doing quite well. But the real question is, what is the value in venture? Now, if I put on my Rand hat, the social rate of return of venture is actually very high. In 2003, $1 trillion in revenue was created around the United States. There are about 10 million jobs created year after year from the venture capital industry. So we could argue that it's an economic engine that we need. So we can't abandon it. So really the next question is, how do we actually make more money on it as investors? All right, so we have diminishing returns. We essentially have no seed investing in the marketplace today. The marketplace for seed is drying up and is being replaced by angel investing. VCs, in order to sort of make up the difference, decide to go later and actually grow bigger funds so that they're taking less risk. So they're actually investing more like a private equity fund. And now we're seeing corporate firms actually getting into venture capital. Now this has been a very cyclical event. You know, corporations got into venture capital in the 90s. They got into venture capital after the bubble. And now they're actually getting into venture capital again. But what we're starting to see at IV is that corporations are looking at it very differently, especially in the light of the value of intellectual property. And we're starting to see firms approach us not to actually just buy IP from us or license it, but to think of ways of actually how to create the IP. So the next question is, how can we combine IP with the venture capital business model? The problem with IP, though, is it's not dependent on people. Remember, venture capitalists invest in people. They don't invest in just the invention. At IV, we built a business model around owning the invention. In many ways, we're in a transformation phase in our business today. We aggregated 40,000 patents. We probably develop about 2,000 patents a month through our R&D organization. And yet, it's really all about the invention. It's not about writing a business plan. It's not about actually developing the product per se, actually to package it and sell it to an individual. And it's really yet not about the prototypes that need to go along with the IP in order for the company to realize its value. So a lot of the advantages of IP, which is developing it for a patent for $100,000 and then selling it, let's say, for $500,000 or $200,000, or developing a patent for even less than that, let's say $20,000, and getting a 10x return because you actually hit on something really valuable, is a very hit or miss business. And we do about $30 million worth of transactions a month with the hopes of less than 10% of that returning all that value. Now, that can work if you wait long enough. You wait long enough for a company to actually develop the product, and they actually develop the product in the way that a particular patent reads on it, and you hope then that you can extract the royalty from that. But waiting for that to happen is a very long, patient business. Our funds are 20 years funds for that reason. However, if we were to put products into the market that emulated the patents that we developed, we could stimulate returns way faster. So we've actually created, this is just a slide that shows the increase in value. I'm going to skip this slide mostly because of what was talked about earlier today. I was going to talk a little bit about how patent value is being realized, but everyone in this room kind of knows this. But also, the interesting thing about this slide is there is no transparency in how IP is creating value, as someone said earlier. And I put it in here because we actually took out all of the transactions we do in the marketplace, which is quite a large number. And we only just focused on the large ones. And this shows like a dramatic increase from 2010 to 2012. You might believe that there's a hockey stick in the value of divestitures. So this implies that the marketplace is starting to see the value of patents and selling patents. All right. So at IV, we're investigating 3 different models for merging intellectual property with venture capital. The first is an outsourced innovation model. This is really something that it's an experiment that we're working with a few companies where we actually work with them in conjunction where they pay us value up front to develop a new idea. We prosecute and develop all the patents around it. And then we create a holding business that ultimately we transfer back into the company at some future value, unencumbered. So these will be portfolios that we develop that we won't license widely to our investors. And then we will ultimately give that company the option to exclusively own those patents or license them with us broadly to the marketplace. The second one is our Invention Development Fund. And I don't know if you guys know that IV actually has 3 different types of funds. We have the fund that I work for, the Investment Acquisition Fund, which is the $5 billion fund that buys patents. But we have 2 smaller funds. One is IDF and one is ISF. The Invention Development Fund funds research around the globe to develop new ideas. Now they stop short of the product. So, and I'll talk more about that model. And then the ISF fund, which is our lab, is where we've heard about TerraPower and the directional antenna company. That's where we develop actual companies. And Bill Gates invests mostly in ISF for social projects like stopping malaria in Africa or being able to disseminate vaccines globally. So those 2 earlier funds are really focused on building new ideas and investing in actually the development of inventions. The third one is something that we haven't fully exploited yet, but it's this idea that only a certain number of companies can invest at a rate of 200 million to 300 million a year in developing platform technology. So if you think of the Bell Labs example I gave, where Bell Labs was investing 300 million a year in research, a venture private equity model that's investing to the tune of $300 million a year in developing platform technologies would be a third way. So I'll talk about the first way. Essentially, an outsourced innovation fund is an investment vehicle for corporations to build broad ecosystems and to actually control those ecosystems. The one company I can think of today that does this really well is actually Qualcomm. Now, we don't generally think of Qualcomm as a company that's investing widely in invention, but in fact, they do several deals a year funding startups, actually working with universities in developing IP. And we're starting to understand better how their model works. And if you think about Qualcomm, most of their revenue is licensing revenue and selling a standard. If you imagine you could actually create standards pools around certain industries, that would create value that venture capitalists had never really considered when they were funding the VC industry. So this model would have to have several aspects to it. It would enable companies to actually have an R&D organization without actually having to invest internally. So if you think about when a company becomes a mid-sized technology company, they really can only sell their current product and meet the demands of their shareholders by quarterly growth. They're not really allowed to invest off their P&L sheet and grow an R&D facility. By investing in a fund that actually is doing R&D for them and prototyping and development, they can actually take that off their balance sheet and gain the economic system of balance of co-investing in developing new IP products. So this would be targeted innovation for a company that will allow them to create new ideas without having to leverage their own infrastructure. The biggest problem with this model for corporations is competition. So they certainly don't want to do this if their competitors doing it. So at IV, we're thinking of different ways to attract companies to come to us to actually work with us. And we generally pick and choose only one company per industry. We don't pick several companies. So that one company actually gets that advantage. That actually creates scarcity of the IP, which creates value. If the ideas fail, then we can license the rest of the market. So there are other problems that we have to address, and that is time to market. As you guys probably have guessed, R&D takes 5-6 years to advance to a particular state where you actually have a product in the marketplace. So acquiring patents is actually going to be necessary in this model, along with investment in new R&D. So the challenges that a company will have to have if they do this is they'll have to build an acquisition team. They'll actually have to build a team that enables them to value the IP, analyze its encumbrances, and build a moat around the new developments they're making. So this is one piece of the problem that Qualcomm actually addressed by creating an IP strategy team. And they have a team of like 30 engineers that are working on figuring out where the valuable patents are in the world. We actually do this for our investors. So IAF can actually serve as an acquisition model for corporations who want to actually try this. There's a couple of other pieces that companies need to consider, and that is how do we actually think out of the box? How do you innovate and predict where there are disruptions occurring? Now, a lot of the times, this is not cultural to a company. Most of the time, they think they know the answer. Most of the time, they are, they have a product roadmap that they want to stay on, but they're not considering all the options available to them. By working with an outside group, they can actually diversify and actually invest in 3 or 4 different options. So recently, we looked at an acquisition of companies in the memory space, and we found that there were 5 different options for the future DRAM technology that's going to be universal memory. And we were able to see that there were 6 different startups that had been funded by VCs, all too early. Marketplace isn't coming until 2018. But the IP was being offered on the market for $20 to $25 million. Now, the big companies that have been investing in this hadn't really thought of these different strategies. So they're now paying a high price to get access and acquiring that IP after the fact and continuing to develop it. So there is value in working with entrepreneurs because they generally have out-of-the-box thinking. So this type of model will give corporations access to this out-of-the-box thinking option. The key here is really, is there going to be an alignment of goals? In a traditional fund, if we think about intellectual property funds like ours, we're acquiring patents, we're trying to build licensing programs, and we're essentially trying to license the market at a point in time when we can get the highest leverage. That means we have to acquire patents rapidly that we identify for licensing opportunity. We have to be able to acquire patents very quickly. And then we actually have to be able to figure out where we can license broadly. This generally isn't aligned with a corporate goal, which is they want exclusive rights. They want to be able to prevent their competitors from having access. And they want to actually create new business opportunities. So in order to align these goals is the company and the fund together need to invest in understanding very targeted areas to invest in. You can invest broadly. So unlike venture capital where you're trying to have diverse investments, you really need to have very focused investments on a single ecosystem. And then you actually need to understand what the options are within that model. So you really need to develop a plan that predicts where you want to be in 7 years from now and then ultimately investing in the ecosystem that's going to give you the optionality to grow the business. Ultimately, these ideas can come internally. The corporation can actually spin them off, the ideas, or they can actually be targeted at the venture world. What will this require? There are 4 things that this will require. It requires an invention network. And an invention network is really a network of entrepreneurs or inventors that you've identified that actually can do R&D. This could be university professors. This could be entrepreneurs who have a repeat ability to build products quickly in venture capital portfolios. That venture network has to be well mapped. You have to really understand what the skill sets of that venture network are and be able to clearly be able to map the problems that a company is trying to solve to that. You actually have to develop a prosecution department. Now, most startups don't think about prosecuting patents. In fact, they don't even have a budget for that. So we've talked about earlier how companies don't know the value of IP, but imagine if you started a company with a concept that you have an IP department and you're going to prosecute your patents carefully for developing ideas around all the different options for developing your product. You'll actually have a much more robust system of patents that will be valuable in the long run. You have to be able to have an acquisitions team that can acquire patents, value patents, do the technical diligence on the patents. And finally, you have to have a strategic objective in mind. What are the markets you want to go after? What are the complementary markets you want to invest in? All of those things are required for a corporate outsourced innovation fund to operate. You also need a partner. So a company like ours, which can provide acquisition capability, prosecution capability, technical diligence capability, allows a company to be able to build a fund like this and outsource a lot of the activities that they don't have the skill sets internally. So the second model that I want to talk about is really an adjunct to this model. The first model is really the corporation's point of view. Like when they invest, what are they going to get out of it? And this model is really the model that we've been developing at IDF, which is actually how do you run the business of actually creating the invention. Now, we have a $650 million fund, and we invested in more than 1,000 ideas. And we were looking 7 years, 8 years, 10 years in the future. So we were trying to predict what are the products that are going to exist in 2020. And the hope was that companies would have to go in the direction where we were inventing. Now, the question you might ask is, how did we figure out where to invent? One of the projects that I've been working on is identifying all of the interesting IP that's developing around a certain problem space. So every 6 weeks, we look at a different question. And that question might be, what happens when you have a lot of data centers that actually have to move terabytes of data across a central server network? How is that problem going to be solved? So we ask what are the bottleneck questions that are out there, and then we look for the IP that's being invented in that place, and we evaluate the IP. Out of that, you get this landscape of opportunities. And we've done about 60 of these projects over the last couple of months. And what we find is there are holes. There are things that people didn't think of. There are things that people should have thought of in order for the whole system to work. And we invest in creating those ideas. We go find the inventor and we develop the ideas. Now, the problem with that model alone is you're sitting and you're waiting for the market to evolve. So what we do first is we find the individuals, we work with, and they're mostly in universities or research institutions, and then we'll go to a company and we'll make sure that it's sort of aligned to their product roadmap. And then finally, we'll actually invest in building a profit-sharing model. Now, we stop short of building the company. We actually give the inventor a 17% return on their IP group that we create. And if we license it, they're guaranteed that 17% return. So we actually don't dilute the inventor. We actually maintain their share at 17%. So we successfully sell the idea to a company later on, they get tremendous value. Now, we have 25,000 inventors, 4,000 are active. We're doing this over 12 countries, but we don't build a product. So a lot of these inventors are sitting and waiting for their idea to come to market. And out of these, we're probably working on about 30 ideas right now that we're trying to commercialize. And it's only after the fact of creating this inventory of ideas that we figured out, you really do need to have a product go along with the IP for a company to want to use it. In effect, we've built the inventor network for a company. They can actually come to us and get access to our 25,000 inventors. The corporation doesn't have to build that inventor network that I talked about. They can actually leverage the one that we've developed for them. So how does this work? How do we engage 25,000 inventors? Well, when I talked about identifying the problems, we first identify the problem, and you can imagine now partnering with a corporation to identify the problem. Then we define a description. So if you think of NSF, we put out a request for invention. The inventors respond. They send in patent disclosures. They send in ideas of how they would solve the problem. So it's sort of like crowdsourcing. And then we pick a handful of those inventions to actually develop. And we'll then invest in the R&D, and actually we help them develop the idea. And we actually invest in the R&D phase, which allows them to do research to create more patents. And then ultimately, we create a patent pool. Now, the next step really should be creating the company. So now if you combine this now with an outsourced innovation from the corporation, you can imagine now being able to invest in creating individual businesses that would actually lead to ultimately a product, the IP portfolio that actually gets leveraged by a corporation. So corporations can now dig through our ideas and say, hey, are any of these on our product roadmap? And actually pay for the development of the actual prototyping of the product. So ultimately, we can have many financial instruments that allows us to monetize the IP. It doesn't necessarily have to be just the assembling of the IP products, but it could be spin-outs, it could be licensing, it could be actually creating companies with the individual inventors actually continuing to do development for the companies. But this step here, step 6, is what requires the new type of capital. This is what requires combining venture capital with corporation capital and IP capital to actually develop the key instruments that will actually monetize the IP. So this is actually something we thought about when we were at Tim Draper's fund. And interestingly enough, when I built this in 2004, the thing I left out was prosecuting the patents. So identifying the market, developing strategic relationships, and actually prototyping was the idea. And the idea really was that Series A funding today doesn't exist, or was very scarce. So there needed to be a prototyping kind of fund that actually led to the stage where VCs could actually make their first investment. So what is the difference between a traditional model and this model that I'm talking about? Well, the traditional VC starts with the business plan. They don't develop the business plan. They don't think of the idea. They don't think of developing the IP. They don't think about how to prosecute the IP. They focus on management. They focus on launching the corporation and ultimately distribution sales of the product. All of that exists today. Mid-sized companies, when I talked about the small company and large companies, already have distribution. They already have customers. They already have channels. Why do the VCs need to actually spend capital at that stage when the corporations already have all that infrastructure? VCs really should be focusing on where are the opportunities. Now, the data, as I talked about, is out there for VCs actually to predict where the market's going. But they're not using that data because they don't actually have the in-house expertise to analyze patents, to analyze innovation, to understand where inventors have expertise and where they can solve problems. If they invested in the upfront inventions in developing the ideas that are actually solving a market opportunity and focus then on developing the right business plan, then they would get a higher return on investment because it would be much more aligned with the goals of a corporation. So now if you imagine you're combining these two together, you actually have an innovation model that's kind of like what Bell Labs was. You know, AT&T kind of did it without even thinking about it. They invested in a lot of ideas. They brought in the best inventors. They seeded them with solving problems. And they built a very advanced network that we take advantage of today. But we don't really think about the AT&T network and the wireless networks that we have all coming out of brainstorming, solving really hard problems during the previous century. The venture capital community could do this if there were several companies that were providing them with the data that would allow them to make smarter investments. So the idea really is you have a venture capital firm in the middle with an IP focus that really is bringing all these pieces together. The invention, parameters, the market verification, the prototyping of components, and design specs that allow people to reuse capital and infrastructure over and over and over, and partnering with companies to actually enable them to innovate outside their corporation. Because the reality is, this outsourced innovation is what's important. The corporation really can't do this internally when they're really focused on their core business. So the final thing I wanted to talk about, and you guys can read that slide, is our VPE model. And what we've built at IV is really a corporation that has several active licensees. We have $6 billion under committed capital. We have 800 employees, and we're globally active around the globe. Now, that enables us to actually build ecosystems for corporations. There is no other private fund that actually can build an innovation ecosystem at scale. What we'd like to do is partner with a few companies and investors to fund projects at $100 million to $200 million each. So instead of giving a startup $2 million or $1 million, we'd actually give the startup $100 million. And the idea is, behind giving a startup $100 million, is that they can solve a really hard problem. Now, if you think of the iPhone that Apple created, it was built on a platform. They started with the iPod. Well, actually, they started with the computer, and if you guys remember, they had a Newton. So they had already built a tablet in the early 90s. But they had to shrink it down, and there had to be network, and there actually had to be value in terms of media, and they had to build a store, and then they had to partner with Disney to actually get access to the content. And then they had to make the phone, and then they had to build the app store, and they had to build the app infrastructure for the store. And then the iPad. All of that took 10 years to build. Imagine if you could create all of that infrastructure at the beginning, that you could invest in all the different pieces that are required to make that successful. You could fund all the individual researchers, understanding all the different parts that it took to actually make the iPad successful. You could accelerate innovation for a company way faster. There are very few companies could achieve what Apple had achieved all by themselves, because that's a variety of different technologies that you have to invest in to actually bring that product to market. There are very few companies that could achieve that. And they need a partner like what we built here to actually build that kind of innovation at scale. So that's why you don't see many products like that coming out very often. It actually takes a very, very long time. Now, after you built that ecosystem, iterating on that product and creating value becomes easy. This is why Apple has lock-in. You know, they build a cloud service, so all your content's in the cloud. Then they build cloud management. Then they build an Apple TV. Then they bring a TV to the market. Then they invest in Tesla. Then they have a car. You can sort of see where they're going. But they built this ecosystem to actually continue to expand what they started. Very few companies can do that. The system of IP would allow them to actually, will allow any company with the right vision to be able to build that kind of platform. So this is where I'm going to stop to bring you questions. But really, this is what we want to get to: venture capital at scale. We're starting small with the inventor. We figured out how to build an inventor network. We're now partnering with companies to actually figure out how to productize that through prototypes. And ultimately, we want to build hundreds of these, be able to do it at scale where you could prototype rapidly with any company on demand. Questions?
Do you have formal relationships with academic institutions? Because those are oftentimes fountains of invention and IP.
Yeah, so we have partnerships with several universities around the globe. In fact, we have an international base of universities that we work with. And in actuality, this is, as you might know, it's actually a problem sometimes partnering with universities because of the Bayh-Dole Act and because when you have government funding of a building, partnership research is difficult. But we've gotten around a lot of those issues, and we have a very robust university network. One thing I should note about the university question is the universities are still not on board with the idea of professors working on market-driven questions. So being an academic at one stage in my life, scientists and professors tend to want to solve a problem that's going to win them a Nobel Prize. That's still what they're being measured on. The incentives in a university for creating patents aren't really there yet. I mean, even at Stanford and MIT, the premier professors aren't being rewarded for creating spin-offs. But the younger generation that we're finding of young graduates are way more interested in creating the next Facebook. And so I think there's going to be a transition of behaviors in universities that are going to be more aligned with this model. So it's a very good question, and we're working very closely with aligning ourselves with younger inventors who want to have this opportunity to build businesses.
What you consider to be an ideal tech transfer situation in the university?
Yeah, so an idea there really would be a project that has been invested in over 15 years. So most research has a very long time scale before a professor actually gets to a point where they can actually conceptualize a product. So my research at the University of Rochester was in an optical transistor. So my advisor started with how do you make a laser exhibit gain, and then he went to how do you attach that device onto silicon, and then he went to how do you package it, and then he went into how do you interconnect it with, a next generation system. That took 15 years of research. So I actually just called him up recently and I said, okay, where are you at? Well, that's the kind of tech transfer option that we would want to invest in because, he has patents that are developed. He has actually, concepts that we could actually deploy, and now we can invest in the next step of actually getting him to actually a marketable product. So it has to be something that has a longer term sort of path of invention to get to the marketplace.
Darius, you have a very collaborative model with corporations, which is venture on demand, IP venturing, invention on demand, whatever way you want to characterize it. But then you also have a traditional licensing business, which can be quite adversarial. How can the two coexist together?
I believe it can. I'll talk a little bit about our licensing business and where we're at and why I think that this will be incredibly valuable for the next phase of IV. Our first fund was really about insurance clearance, if you think about it. I mean, we really were buying off patents off the street so that Microsoft, Intel wouldn't get sued. And we created the broker marketplace, and I think Ocean Tomo was very involved in that, to actually build a marketplace so that IP could be monetized very rapidly through our acquisitions team. And most of our licensing revenue came from our investors, right? So you were an exclusive club, and really that's what RPX's model is more like. In our second fund, and I joined halfway through the investment cycle, we were developing investment strategies for licensing. And the idea really is we build large programs, a large number of assets that cover reads on current product lines. So if you think about it, most of the licensing revenue we get is because of infringement today. This model is about how do you predict where infringement is going to be in the future. Now, we only offer this service to a select few companies. And in reality, when we sell the IDF sort of tech transfer package, sometimes we're not even selling it to a company that's big enough to pay us a license or is way early in their life stage of development. So this would be a great model for, let's say, Facebook, who has very little revenue, but lots of equity. And they want to protect that equity, and they want to be able to invest in outsourced R&D and rapidly scale their business so that they compete with Google. So we would offer a service like this to a newly minted IPO company that needs to rapidly innovate, build an IP portfolio to compete with an incumbent. So that's what this is targeted at. It's not really targeted at the traditional company that's been around for a while. It's more targeted at the new company that needs rapid growth. And that's how we're differentiating the service and the licensing. Yes?
Go back to IDF a bit and talk about the problem isolation, identification. It seems like the process, if I heard correctly, is sort of top-down, or at least internal to IV. And I'm just wondering how you think about transparency and maybe putting at least the problem sourcing more bottom-up and making that more sort of crowdsourced, and just what your views are about transparency in terms of project development and agenda.
Yeah, so you're right. The first one was very top-down driven. Edward, if you think about IV and the founders, ISF was sort of Nathan's project. IF was the accident that helped them make money, and IDF is Edward Young's project. And so they assemble a lot of VCs and smart people who had a point of view about the future. And it's not really top-down driven in the sense that we looked at where people are innovating, and then we looked for holes, and then we picked those ideas. In the future, we're going to do it more collaboratively with corporations. So we've invited a few corporations to come to us and say, how would you leverage our network? And we publish all the RFIs on the network, so anyone can join. So any inventor can actually join our invention network. It's called IVEN. And the problems are all published there. And in reality, what we've done is we create a social network of inventors to actually collaborate and talk to each other and talk about the problems that they're solving. So we're actually witnessing them actually propose ideas. Now, we haven't decided to monetize or invest in those ideas, but that will be the next step. So the next step will be to identify the problem sets that they want to develop, and they can come to us and then propose inventions. The other step is corporations. Corporations have a problem set of problems that they want to solve. We believe that those are the ones we want to focus on. The corporations actually know better what are the market problems and what are the solutions they need. So we're hoping to open the network up to them to actually propose options for us and then co-invest in the development. So we'll co-invest in the IP, they'll co-invest in the product development, and then out comes, a prototype and a well-developed prosecuted portfolio. So it'll be transparent in the sense of if you join the network and we allow you in, but it's still going to be fairly private in terms of the vast majority. I think ultimately we should open it up. I think ultimately that's the kind of data that the whole industry needs. And that's the kind of data that will drive value for this instrument. Because if you want to have transparency, you want to be able to understand where is the ecosystem of problems being solved and how would you rate the inventors that are actually inventing. If you could sort of create a rating system and you knew that there was professors at Stanford or this professor at Caltech solving this problem and they're racing to the answer, then you can kind of create a model where you could see, wow, if I invest in that, there's certain value that I can get on the end. So that's something that we have been thinking about, like how do we put value into this? And we would actually give points to inventors for contributing value. So the more you contribute to the system, the more points you have, and with that points you can cash in, services from us. So we're thinking of different ways where we can build value into that network. Yes.
The venture industry generally, and are they starting to see the vision that you articulated of let's define an industry, let's develop a solution, and then let someone else build a brick and mortar distribution?
Yeah, so I created this slide for that question. So I've been recently talking to former colleagues of mine about this approach. And whenever I presented to them, say, oh, that's obvious. Yeah, we should definitely do that. We want to partner with you. We want to figure this out. The reality is when it actually comes to actually doing it, they're not ready. They still fundamentally believe that the value is in the people. and that if you invest in the right people, they will figure all this out. At IV, Nathan and Edward still believe in the patents, and they think that as long as we have the patents, someone's going to come to us for them and pay us a lot of money. So there's still kind of a divide between getting the two to intersect. The corporations are really the ones who are seeing this value right now. I think once the corporations are on board and they see corporations starting to buy companies for significant value, the VCs will come along. The VCs are very much like lemmings. They go kind of where the market is. Tim Draper is a very innovative thinker. His firm is willing to experiment with me on this because they have a network of smaller funds that want to get an advantage. But I would say that the majority of VCs don't yet understand that they need to create a prosecution department in their company when they fund it in the Series A. Like, imagine if you thought about all the ideas that your supplier is going to use and your distributor is going to use, and all the different ways your competitor may actually create the product, and you actually did all those patent disclosures at that point in time. If your company went under, the value of your portfolio would be way more than the investment that was made by the time you go under, assuming you don't waste cash on distribution yet. But the point that I wanted to make on this slide was, at the Series B, most companies are failing. 90% of the companies have failed to deliver a product that is needed in the marketplace. But if they had done careful prosecution with $10 million of capital, and I'm suggesting investing $1 million to $1.5 million of that initial $10 million in prosecution, then you'd actually have a liquidation option, where you could actually potentially sell the portfolio for $20 million. I'm starting to educate VCs on this. They want to experiment, but for the most part, it's very few that are actually seeing this. So I think we're starting with corporations for that reason.
Dan McCurdy with AST. I'd like to just get your view on sort of what you call the Edward Nathan approach, which is the values and the patents. So as I understand the argument, this is about venture level investment, new thinking about new ways to do something.
Yes.
And as we know, even the best laboratories in the world, like Bell Labs and IBM Research, more Nobel laureates than sort of anything that's ever been created, the vast majority of their patents are worthless. When I was head of IP at Lucent, we had 23,000 patents, and we based an entire licensing program on 60 of the 23,000 patents as being commercially valuable. That's not to say there might not have been 60 more.
Right.
But what it says is it's an extraordinarily inefficient way, it would strike me, to go about building some kind of an investment fund, knowing that 95 or 98% of the patents that you create are going to be worthless.
Right.
So, it's not the patent that matters for any company. It's what you do with that idea.
Right.
You've got to turn it into a product that becomes pervasive in the marketplace globally for it to be a valuable patent.
Right.
And I'm trying to reconcile those ideas with what you said against at least what my experience is a different reality. So
ISF is really the idea that they originally had. You guys may not know this, but when Intellectual Ventures started, it was really an incubator. They understood that the value of an idea was actually need to be manifested in a startup. So ISF was created, and our laboratory was created for that purpose. I think the patents that we create internally with inventors, they understand that that's really valuable. They decided to invest in things that are highly risky and speculative, like TerraPower, like a next generation nuclear power reactor. And so I think their fundamental belief is, to your point, that the best ideas are going to come out of the ideas that we come up with and the ones that we actually find the right inventors to develop with us. The IAF fund, I think, is more of a transactional business that's taking advantage of a dislocation in the market today, where a lot of companies didn't realize that they needed to have IP portfolios fully developed, and so we can now go sell them IP portfolios. or a lot of companies want to avoid getting sued by small MPEs so we can buy up those assets. And, and secondly, we can actually build, licensing programs to create a cost leverage between our investors and their competitors. That's very different than what they originally wanted to do. They now understand what we built, and we built a very strong transactional business model around that. I think IDF is really the manifestation of this belief that patents alone aren't valuable. That's why we created the Inventor Network. Now, the Inventor Network is really the value. It's the people that we're investing in to invent, and we're trying to attract the best inventors to invent for us. And we invent very small ideas. I mean, we probably get 1,000 people responding to a single RFI, and then we'll filter that down to about 10. So we've already done the filtering that you're talking about. Most ideas are really not going to be valuable. AT&T didn't do that. I mean, AT&T had, 30,000 employees and maybe, let's say, 15 to 2,000 actually doing research. They selectively chose those people to come and work there, but those researchers were solving problems for AT&T and patenting the problems for AT&T. They weren't licensable. They were actually for defense. They weren't for offense. Imagine now if you actually build portfolios for offense. So I think the reason why patents aren't valuable, and mostly were not valuable in those days, is because they weren't building portfolios for licensing. They were building portfolios to protect their monopolies. And patenting the way you do something so that you have those exclusive rights can't really be licensed to a competitor. This is very different. This is saying, let's build a portfolio that we know we ultimately might have to license if we don't succeed. So you build a defensive portfolio and an offensive portfolio. And if you're thinking about those ideas offensively and you're actually able to develop a prototype that you can transfer it with, then there's value. So they understand that, but they think that they only need to do it from the invention stage. They believe the corporations as customers will come and pay for the next stage, and that's where the demand is. So they still think it's way cheaper to let the corporation fund the development of the productization phase, as opposed to seeding that and stimulating the market. I'm really just asking them, seed a little bit of it and attract more customers to actually come to us to take it further. Does that help answer your question?
It helps me understand your point.
Yeah. Look, Nathan and Edward, I think in many ways, from an outside guy, a guy who lived in Silicon Valley and then came to Seattle, wanted to make a point to the VC world. They wanted to say, hey, we can make more money. We don't ever have to invest in a single company. The reality is IDF is this experiment where they're realizing that they do actually have to make some form of a bet in people management and actually taking a product to market. The only question is how much? And I think that's the debate that we're having internally, is how much is enough to stimulate a market to actually use the idea that you developed. And that's always going to be, there's always going to be risk. You never have a perfect answer. Any more questions?
Is there a sector of interest?
So that's a very good question. Without revealing who we're working with, there's several sectors that we're looking at. We're looking at next generation financial services. We're looking at mobile health systems. We're looking at bioinformatics. So how do you take information and turn the medical industry into a more information age-driven business as opposed to a diagnostic-driven business? And this is in the form of you just have all these disparate data systems out there that most people in the bio space can't communicate. So, they don't have, the electronic design, the mechanical design, and all the design systems that everyone sort of uses as a standard base for developing something, or software tools. They're still in the very early stages of that. So we're looking at how do you build a standard for modeling the body or modeling drug development. And we're also considering 3D printing technology. So how do you standardize this concept of using very diverse materials and being able to develop things with 3D printers?
Looking at those sectors, are those sectors driven by the technology, or they're driven by a market cap with high return on investment in the future?
A combination of both. We tend to look for opportunities where a disruption needs to occur, where there's a lot of value that can be captured because of that disruption. So if you can imagine that you could print a table on demand and you didn't have to hold inventory, right? That creates a very disruptive value in the retail sector. If you imagine that you could monitor people's health in real time and then create insurance instruments based on how their behaviors are, then you could sort of unravel the health insurance industry, right? So we sort of look at how technology can unravel value and shift value dramatically to a different sector. And we're looking for corporations who understand that their business could be at risk if they don't invest in these disruptive opportunities that are going to shift their business dramatically. So that's how we identify opportunities.
So Darius, maybe I can ask one more question. You referenced corporate partnerships a number of times in your talk. I didn't hear reference to governments, and I know that that's an issue Edwards thought about. Is this model being pointed towards sovereign nations as well from a development standpoint?
Yeah, so I purposely didn't include governments, mostly because I couldn't include everything. So yes, the VPE model is actually built on a governance process in cooperation with government. So we are talking to several countries around building innovation platforms. And the idea is instead of raising, $1 billion from KKR or a set of corporations, we would get a country to actually give us that capital. And then we would build the platform by which medium to small sized companies would have access to new types of development, and they would be able to, and we would sort of develop new services and products on that platform. But this is really around it's mostly those projects are really around infrastructure building and how do you actually provide the infrastructure to actually innovate on top of. So that includes building infrastructure as well as system infrastructure. It's less about the kind of innovation that you guys are thinking about. So that's more of how do governments fund installation of infrastructure projects that enable companies to build on top of, and to maintain the business layer for their medium-sized small businesses to actually be able to innovate rapidly. So yeah, so we are looking at those projects as well, and that's what the venture private equity model is mostly based on, and what it's being developed for. Any other questions?
Great.
One more question. Yeah.
Sorry, just a fast question, Darius. Very interesting talk. I'm Dean Becker from ICAP. And how does purchasing available technologies / patents that could be currently available around the world mold into this model? And I say that in a self-serving way because that's what I do, which is sell patents.
Yeah. So, and I'll reference the previous panels. Most companies didn't do this from the beginning, and so they have very weak portfolios. I think that in order for a company to build an IP for defense capability, they're going to need to be able to acquire patents. So I think patent acquisition is a very key component to this piece. I think you can't accelerate this model without IP acquisitions. And I probably didn't emphasize that enough earlier, that if a corporation wants to really do this, they have to have an IP acquisition scheme. So I think current infringement, current patents that are unencumbered, that a company can acquire to leverage against someone entering their market, attacking them, or building a protection layer so that they can compete more effectively, is going to be required. So you can jumpstart the value of creating an entity like, a portfolio of IP like this, or access to development of new technologies by buying current infringement as well. So I think it goes hand in hand, and a company really just has to create a budget for that, for all these options.